Hi, this is Jessica Lewis. I have a Time to Wine broadcast that's featured on the second and fourth Monday of the month at 9 a.m. and the first and third Friday at 11 a.m. featuring experts in wine, social media marketing, and marketing. And today, Jerry Eisterhold, is that correct? Did I get
Eisterhold.
Eisterhold. Okay, Eisterhold is the owner and winemaker of Vox Vineyards, where 42 varieties of grapes were raised, bottled to make wines that have won dozens of awards. So why don't you start by telling us a little bit about your background?
Well, my background, there are several threads. One is agricultural. I was raised on a small farm in a town that had 72 people after I left on the Gasconade River, which is upstream from Hermann, Missouri, which is kind of recognized as, one of the center of Missouri viticulture for some years. So there's always been that kind of curiosity about grapes. It comes from gathering wild grapes out in the fields and even making wine from anything that didn't move back when I was, back on the farm. But then went through several transitions from College of Agriculture to art school to design to a career designing museums, which is all about kind of conveying history and culture to people, and which is all about identity, all sorts of things. But in the course of that, I came across a book by one Thomas Volney Munson, written back in 1913, I think, where he described like the hundreds of varieties of grapes that he had developed, built around the 31 species of grapes that he had identified. And one of the things you learn in doing history museums is that not everything new is better than it was in the past. And given the unfortunate history of prohibition in the country, and particularly in Missouri, it seemed like there was kind of a lost civilization that could that warranted a little bit of investigation. So that buying that book, I think, is if I reflect on it, actually, it would have been cheaper if I'd kind of taken on a gambling debt or something like that. But there you are. I try to warn parents about being careful about what books they let their children read. But, so now we are kind of suffering the consequences because in addition to doing the grape thing, Munson was also a philosopher. And he had he and several of the other Missourians that we might talk about later kind of had an idea of developing a dynamic indigenous, agriculture, horticulture. And he also had an idea that, which is something I kind of learned on a different track in design school, that it wasn't enough to just have an idea in your head, but you had to kind of work it through to conclusion. So once bitten with the curiosity of like, I wonder what these grapes are all about, then you're kind of committed to tracking them down and figuring out how they grow, which took about 12 to 16 years before we could track down a cutting of this and a cutting of that and establish, 12 plants of each of these varieties just to see what would grow here and produce a reasonably tasting grape. And that was followed by, of course, once you got the grapes, you have to figure out how to make the wine. And as you know, if you approach an experiment with an open mind and you're asking a question, like, are these grapes viable and do they make a good wine? Sometimes the answer is no. So some of these suck. I mean, we have pulled out about 20 of these things because they have notes of Labrusca, or they're just prone to disease or what have you. But there's still a lot of material there that makes grapes and their wine that is really interesting and really unique. And they don't behave the way that vinifera grapes do. So it's like a conversation, but each click in the conversation takes a year. I mean, you try this, you see what the results are. You try something else, you try something else, and so it's definitely not been a a source of instant gratification. But somebody's got to do it because nobody else with any common sense would. So here I am.
Well, it's also revitalizing a piece of American history, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and as I said, history is just because something happened 100 years ago doesn't mean that it's not viable going future. I mean, we also take the view in doing these history museums, which you may find ironic or not, that no one really cares about history. They only care about sort of, what's going to happen, but history can kind of teach you what the parameters are of what might happen, and it can give you models for going forward. So this is, I mean, it's really a forward-looking venture, because I think diversity and just exploring this sort of untapped resource is something that's viable and needs to be done.
So I wanted to ask you, how did you get into working in museums from your career?
In a similar non-direct route, so as I said, I started, raised on a farm, went to University of Missouri, entered ag school because I simply had no idea there was anything else you could do for a living. I mean, I'd not seen non-German, people who wore suits or any of that until I went to college, and it was kind of an eye opener. But from ag school, I kind of became aware of a larger world, so I went into the sciences, which to me were subjects that if you paid attention, you could get A's. But it was the art school that I found confusing. And my reasoning was that the reason you go to school is to learn stuff that you don't know. So I transferred to that, which my GPA went down a whole point, but it was sure as hell more interesting. But then from there, realized that there was a much more rigorous program at the Kansas City Art Institute, which at the time was second to Yale in terms of anyone who made it through that program. And it was a gauntlet. It would take a class of 40 and weed it down to 5, because they simply had no respect for the economics of the higher education. But regardless of that, but given that education with a degree in graphic design and a minor in photography, I will say that I've never had a job in either of those disciplines, but they kind of gave you the tools to kind of apply this sort of design thinking approach to what it is that you do. So my first career was actually doing animation, because it sounded interesting, and it was. But one day there was a job opening at the local museum, and by my reasoning, it's like, well, I don't know anything about that, so let's try this out. And I guess the rest is history. I've been stuck there ever since, because when you do museums, every time you do a project, you're sort of learning about a whole new world. So in a way, what we're doing out here at Vox is just kind of the same thing, except nobody's paying for it.
Okay, so we'll just go right into, I know your Vox is also a museum. So do you want to talk a little bit about your winery and the museum quality to it?
Well, so it's all about getting people to be interested in the story and what they can learn and explore. So as far as the vineyard goes, we started with, I say about 60 varietals. And I say about because when you're collecting these sticks from various places, you'll get a bundle that has 12 vines and they come up as 3 different vines, or you get 2 different bundles from different places with different names, but they're clearly the same grape. So to this day, I have no idea how many varieties, because there's always like a half a dozen or a dozen that I don't know what they are, where they come from. But like I said, you work with them, you see what they have to do, and then you try to do the grapes and make the wine. So a corollary of that, though, is that besides growing the grapes and making the wine, you gotta get people to try the wine. And it's not like anyone's ever going to go into a restaurant and say, I want me a Wetumpka, because they don't know that it exists. So you have to get people to be curious about exploring something where they have no idea what it is that's going to be inside that bottle once they open it. I mean, there's tastings and all that, but the point is there's sort of an anti-brand identity to these varietals.
So are you promoting these predominantly locally, or are you doing any sort of national promotion or international promotion?
Well, honestly, something we also found in the museum world, there's that hero in your hometown kind of effect. That we did the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, for instance, where nobody in Memphis wanted to see that place memorialized or anything done with it, but there were people from around the world coming to this site. So it's as though people outside of where you are appreciate what it is more than people inside the fence. That's not to say we're not trying to promote kind of a regional pride. I mean, people should be proud of the stuff that comes from this place that is an agricultural thing, but it is capable of some transcendence. And we'll get back around to that in a minute. But you know, we've been to France a couple of times. The first was a presentation about exploring diversity, and they are really interested in this just from the point of view of, well, they are aware of global warming. As I sometimes say, we're in a red state, so we don't have global warming. We don't have to worry about that. But people in other parts of the world, you know, are kind of wondering what to do about that. And that's a part of it. There's also, from the other end, there was a French filmmaker that came out here it was last year, doing a film. It's kind of related to the global warming issue or the politics of winemaking in Europe. A lot of these vines were propagated around the world back in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, and are now illegal because of the DOC regulations that were implemented back in 55 or 1855 and so forth. But there are still pockets of these grapes, and the people that grow them love them, but they're not allowed to make them commercially. And what's happening now with the EU kind of moving into Romania and places like that, where people have acres of these grapes planted, they're being told to rip them out and plant them over to, you know, Vitis vinifera or something. And if you're a small winemaker in a country like that, you can't afford to just lose crop for several years. So there's kind of a political issue, and this film was made, and it won the, there is such a thing, the French Oscar, wine film Oscar or some such last year, which we weren't able to go to because we missed it by a few days. So that there's interest overseas is the point of all this stuff, and we're trying to get people around the. I mean, we've given presentations at the Smithsonian, several, and you know, there's a great interest for the people that become aware that this is a thing going on.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of American heritage grapes. So we know there is a history of that. And then did you already address this, or did you want to talk a little bit more about it?
We can talk about American grapes because it's
it goes on for hundreds of years.
Because that's what we're here. Well, let's see. Where to begin? So a lot of people assume that, Jessica, are you able to show a graphic of like that seed chart or anything like that with this program? Or
I'm not. Later we can do it again, and we can try that again, but I don't have it available right now.
Well, a lot of people assume that American grapes means Concord or Labrusca. That sort of, you know, foxy, the fox grape that has that sort of musty, wet dog flavor that you don't really want to put in your mouth with food. But, Munson identified 31 species of grapes. Now, there's another guy named George Eggleman who was a founder of the American Science Foundation, identified 12. The point is, and now I think if you go to Wikipedia, there's 60 to 80. The point is that these species are very fungible. The boundaries are kind of blurry, and there's continuing argument about how many species there are, but they all interbreed readily. But every time you plant a grape seed, you get a unique plant. So every Cabernet Sauvignon vine in the world came from one seed once upon a time that has been asexually reproduced ever since. So if you were to scatter 300 grape seeds out there, you get 300 different wines. So you can imagine well, just the diversity that is inherent, the potential diversity that is inherent in that. Now, go back to a little history. Probably a lot of if you have wine fans tuning into this, they're aware of the phylloxera epidemic that wiped out the European grapes, 1840s, 50s, and so forth. The Missouri State entomologist was instrumental in working with Emile Planchon out of Montpellier, France, to identify what the phylloxera problem was. And that's a whole long story because it was a really difficult bug to detect what was going on. And you remember at the time, this was Louis Pasteur when he was discovering the germ theory. So it took about 7 years for the French Academy to acknowledge that these bugs were killing the vines, as opposed to the vines were having a moral foundation and were therefore being attacked by the bugs. So Riley was given the Chevalier, basically the Legion of Merit award by the grateful French nation for figuring this out. T.V. Munson came along and figured out what one of the solutions was to this problem, which was to graft the European vines onto American rootstock, which is why most 97% of global vineyards are sitting on top of American rootstock. There's a small percentage that isn't, where the Laos doesn't really like sandy soil, so there are little pockets here and there where that can happen. But those were the fundamental technical innovations. There was also a whole host of Germans that moved to the central Missouri, and this became kind of the hotbed of experimentation and breeding and grape cultivation and so forth. And the guy at the University of Missouri, George Hussman, who is the book that I read that told me how to plant the vineyard, which is why we're modeled on his book and not any other vineyard in the Midwest. Went out to start the UC Davis program. A lot of these guys were, sort of the I don't know, the pantheon of viticulturalists on a global scale. Another person in there was Herman Jaeger out of Neosho, Missouri, and he developed a grape called Jaeger's Number 40 that became the female progenitor for most of the basics of the French American hybrids. So when you have Vidal and Traminette, grapes like that come out of that strategy, which was to interbreed the French and the American grapes. So all these foundational pieces kind of came out of these Missouri/Midwestern Germans. There's much more to that too, but we should probably go on and talk about other things.
Well, because this is so innovative and you're doing something so different, do you have people visiting you from abroad? You mentioned UC Davis. Are people from universities or people in the wine industry visiting and seeing the innovation that you're doing?
Yeah, there are. Well, I probably shouldn't name names, but I mean, they will pop up from South Africa and from. I mean, it's not like we have a billboard campaign out there or anything. So the word of mouth trickles out, and somebody will sort of wake up and say, "Holy crap!" And then we're in conversation with them, and we'll see what we can do to kind of get some of these grapes spread around the world and get a little more recognition for them.
Okay. And then I wanted to ask you, so I'm from Montgomery, Alabama, and you mentioned you started museums in Montgomery as well as Memphis. So I'm interested I have a question. It appears to me that when you're doing a museum, that the museum could also revitalize the city as well as you having the museum there or create visitors coming to the city. But I wanted to hear a little bit about what you think about the city revitalization with the museum, but what museums have you worked with? I wanted to hear a little bit about the museum history.
Well, let's see. I'll just rattle off a bunch. I think Boys Town up in Nebraska was our very first real museum. The next significant one was the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis. We've also done the Rosa Parks Museum and Southern Poverty Law Center down in Montgomery, Alabama. A bunch of plans for museums, and we're actually in the process of renewing those museums, the Rosa Parks Museum, because that was 20 years ago. And technology has changed, audiences have changed. Fewer and fewer people have direct knowledge or memory of those events, so you kind of have to give a little more context. We also just recently opened the National Museum of the U.S. Army out at Fort Belvoir, which was probably the largest museum project in the country at the time. Prior to that, the Marine Corps Museum. We did a sit-ins museum down in Greensboro, African American Museum in Philadelphia, also President's House, which was the site of George Washington's first it wasn't the White House because it wasn't white and it wasn't in D.C., but the first president's house way back when, and so on and so forth. So it's really scattered around the country.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about how. So when I post this on LinkedIn, for example, I have viewers that are watching a lot from the European Union and all over the United States and South Africa, et cetera, and I'm being contacted from all over the world. So they're going to see this. How do people find you on social media? I don't want to throw this at you. I wanted to ask you this too. How are you marketing the winery on social media, and how do people find you if they want to visit or contact you? And if you don't want to talk about the marketing, it's okay. You can skip over it.
No, the simplest way is that we have a website, www.VoxVineyards.com. The theory was that Vox would be pretty easy to remember, and Vineyards could be the rest of it. As far as social media goes, I'm reminded of I think it was a Noel Coward quote where he was, someone asked him about the review that showed up in the New York Times, and his response was that, well, the New York Times is not for reading, it's for appearing in. Now, I don't have quite the same attitude, but I'm running 3 businesses, so social media is not in my universe. Sorry, but we have a young guy who does that, and I can give you the or maybe you can pass on the feeds on behalf of Michael.
Okay, I like Michael. I'm running 3 businesses also. I was doing wine tours for a large university, and so I have people asking me to 8 universities asking me to take students to South Africa and Europe. So I'm doing that at the same time and then doing all of this on social media as well. So, okay, thank you, Jerry. I appreciate it so much. This will be aired on Friday at 11 a.m. and it will be on LinkedIn, Facebook Live, Twitter, Periscope, and on YouTube. So we'll pass that around as well. And thank you so much. And I will talk to you soon. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Jessica. Okay.
Thank you.